And with that, today we have Brent Johnstone from Lockheed Martin. Brent is a long-time best in category winner, first time, I believe, best overall, best paper winner. And he's going to be giving today his presentation, Augustine's Laws. Are we really headed for the $800 billion fighter? Brent?
All right. Megan, thank you for the opportunity to address the association. I wish I was there to address you in person. I think we probably would all prefer that rather than working from home or wherever you're working from. I have to say, though, as a kid, I always wanted my dream was to broadcast college football games. And my particular ambition was to broadcast a Texas OU game from the Cotton Bowl in Dallas. Needless to say, that didn't happen, but sitting in a little room addressing an unseen audience, it feels maybe just a little bit like that, except without the marching bands. So as Megan said, my paper today is on Augustine's Laws. Are we really headed for the $800 billion fighter? So it occurs to me that not everybody knows who Norm Augustine is. He is or was a aerospace executive who held a number of positions within government and industry. He served as Undersecretary of the Army during the Ford administration, and he worked for Douglas Aircraft, for LTV, for Martin Marietta, and most prominently, he was president and CEO of Lockheed Martin until he retired in 1997. He published a series of laws which about corporate government and management behaviors that first appeared as an article in Defense Systems Management Review, and expanded it into a book which has undergone a number of editions. There's about 52 of them in total. Rather tongue-in-cheek. I would anyone who's never seen them, I would advise you could go look it up on Wikipedia, and I think they would resonate with anyone that's worked in a large organization or in the defense procurement process. Although I might discourage you if you're easily offended to skip law number 8, which is that the most unsuccessful 4 years in the education of a cost estimator is 5th grade arithmetic. So Norm didn't always think a lot of cost estimators. So probably the most famous of his laws, the one that's most frequently quoted is Law 16, which I've shown above. And that says that in the year 2054, the entire U.S. defense budget will purchase just one aircraft. And that aircraft will have to be shared by the Air Force and the Navy for 3.5 days each week, except for leap year when it's made available to the Marines for the extra day. Now, how did he come up with this? Where did that observation come from? There is actually some level of data and analysis that led him to that conclusion. And what he did was he put together an analysis of tactical aircraft costs from 1910 to 1983. You can see the graph reproduced on the right, going all the way back to the early Wright brothers planes. So a tactical aircraft in the 1910, 1920s, we're in somewhere around less than $10,000 an aircraft. By the time you got to 1983 and you got to planes like the F-14, 15, 16, 18, they were well over $10 million an aircraft. So if you do the math, that's about a 15% increase per year in then-year dollars. Now, if you make a certain set of assumptions about this, if you assume, for instance, that the U.S. defense budget grows by 2.5% a year, and if you assume that the nominal gross national product of the United States grows by 5.5% a year, what you find out is that if you follow the projections on out, by 2054, a single aircraft would be projected to cost $800 billion a year, which, as you can see from the graph, is equal to the projected value of the entire defense budget in 2054. Now, Mr. Augustine titles this chart Calvin Coolidge's Revenge and that's based on a comment that President Coolidge made, frustrated over having the price of having to pay $28,000 for a squadron of aircraft in 1928. He suggested, well, why can't we buy just one plane and let the pilots take turns flying it? Well, Mr. Augustine's concern is that by 2054, that's exactly what we're going to have to do, that we can only afford to buy a single aircraft. And if you follow the projections even further than that, by the year 2100, the single aircraft will cost $3.6 quadrillion a piece, which would be equal to the entire value of the United States gross national product. Now, we're trying to analyze what exactly is going on. Augustine's contention is that technological improvements don't really explain this increase in costs. And the quote, which I've reproduced down below, he says that this rate of growth appears to be an inherent characteristic of these kinds of systems, with the unit cost being more closely correlated with the passage of time rather than technical changes like maneuverability, speed, weight, etc. He also makes the point in the book that it's not just tactical aircraft that show this rapid increase in price over time, but things like commercial aircraft and helicopters, and moving at a somewhat slower pace, but also increasing, would be things like ships and tanks, and even items like automobiles and houses. So I think the point that Augustine is trying to make in his book is that technology often opens up vast new capability vistas that are then crammed into each new generation of the product, making it more and more expensive, because technology opens up the ability to do more. So of course we have to do more. We have to put more performance and more capability into the product, which drives the cost upward, even though we might not really need it, is his point. Okay, so the question of this paper really is the situation really that dire? Are we really just 35 years away from an $800 billion fighter? So my paper really hopes to answer three separate questions. So if we compare fighters over time with a standardized definition of unit cost, after you normalize for inflation, after you normalize for learning curve impacts, are the trends that Augustine observed still apparent? You'll notice in the graph that he showed, he didn't normalize for inflation. It was all then-year costs, and you didn't know at what point on the curve any of those aircraft were. So one of the things I'm going to do in this paper is try to clean that up a little bit and see where things rest after that. Since the initial publication in 1979 and then later in the early 80s, there's been three major fighter aircrafts that have been introduced: the F-18EF, the F-22, and the F-35. When you throw that into the mix, does that change or does that confirm what Augustine projected? The third point is that we all know that fighter aircraft today are much more complex than their post-World War II predecessors. What is the relationship between cost and successive generations of aircraft? How much does an additional capability cost? And is it worth it? So those are the three questions that I hope to answer in the course of this paper. And obviously there's implications, not just on the price of aircraft today, but as we start talking about a sixth generation of fighter aircraft coming down the road that's currently in the planning stages, obviously cost is going to be a major component of what are we going to buy, when are we going to buy it, how many are we going to buy, and so forth. So hopefully this leads into some of that conversation. So I put together a database to go answer that question. So I had 23 U.S. Air Force and Navy aircraft, and the IOC dates were between 1949 and 2016. And the primary data source was a publication called the U.S. Military Aircraft Cost Handbook, which was published in 1983 by MCR. And that pretty much covers everything up through, I think the latest aircraft that would be in there would be the F-18 AB series. For post-1983 aircraft cost data, I collected that on my own from either public domain budget data or GAO data. So everything you see in here is public domain. You can go research it yourself if you like. There's nothing proprietary in there. The data consisted of lot costs that I analyzed using unit learning curves, and the cost that I'm using is a theoretical 100th unit flyaway cost, and including the engines. And everything's been normalized to FY $18, just so we get everything in terms of the same economics. So when we before we proceed into the next stage, one of the things to talk about a little bit to try to analyze this issue of capability and technological advancement, it's very common to hear people talk about generations of fighter aircraft. It's very common to hear people talk about the F-16 or the F-18 as a 4th gen aircraft, and the F-22 and the F-35 as 5th generation aircraft. Talked earlier about a 6th generation aircraft perhaps coming on. So I think it's useful to try to segregate the data by generation to try to determine what's the potential impact of capability improvements. So if we go all the way back to post-World War II aircraft, the very first jet engine aircraft, we're looking at aircraft like the F-86 or the F-89 that have turbojets. Their capability is not that dissimilar from their piston engine predecessors. They're subsonic, they usually don't have a radar, and they can carry, conventional weaponry, machine guns, bombs, no guided missiles, things like that. And that covers the period through about 1955 or so. In 1955, the 2nd generation of aircraft starts being introduced. That's when you get your first supersonic combat aircraft and the introduction of radar and guided missiles. So that's aircraft like basically your Century Series aircraft, the 102, the 106, the 104, the 101, and the 105, and others like that. In the 60s, you have the 3rd generation, which is the introduction really of the multi-role fighter. That combine air defense and ground attack missions into a single configuration. So that would be aircraft like the A6, the F4, the A7, the F111. Okay. 4th generation aircraft, the ones that probably most people are familiar with. Again, that trend towards multi-role aircraft continue, but you have a more advanced avionics system, more advanced weapons. There's now more emphasis on the maneuverability of the aircraft as opposed to just pure speed. And there's a lessons learned incorporated from the Vietnam Air War. So that would include the A-10, the F-16, the F-14, AV-8B, F-15, F-18, and so forth. Some of those 4th generation aircraft in turn have been upgraded. The F-18EF is probably a great example of that, where they took a existing 4th generation aircraft and introduced more advanced electronics and some effort to reduce the radar cross section of the aircraft. So the EF would be probably the best example that we have of what I'll call generation 4.5. And finally, the fifth gen aircraft, where you have the introduction of stealth aircraft, you've got substantially more powerful engines, you've got advanced integrated avionics, and in the case of the F-35, you have a shared battlefield awareness and the ability to work within a broad array of networked systems. So those are the current aircraft that are, top aircraft that are being fielded by the Air Force today. All right, so if we take all that data and we throw it on a chart and look at what the T100 Flyaway dollars are over time, it's very apparent, of course, that it's increased over time, and the annual growth in constant year dollars is about 6.8%. So correlate that against what Augustine was saying, that it was 15% in then year dollars. So from a constant year perspective, using a little bit broader, a little bit different array of aircraft than what he looked at, 6.8%. Now, that's a little tricky because we know that there are differences from a weight perspective in a lot of these aircraft. We know that some of them have 2 engines, some only have 1, so forth. So if we try to normalize using empty weight as an example, then the annual growth in constant year dollars is about 4.4%. Now, what's interesting when you look at the chart is, of course, it's very obvious to see where the generations fall from a time perspective, but also from a cost perspective. So clearly, every generation on average is more expensive than its predecessor. So you've seen this sort of ratcheting up, if you will, from Gen 1 aircraft that were less than $500 a pound to 5th gen aircraft that are more in the range of $3,500 to $4,000 per pound from an empty weight perspective. In my paper, I also have a similar graph that shows the growth in commercial aircraft. So just those numbers are kind of interesting on their own. Depending on whether it's a short range aircraft or a long range aircraft, the growth on the commercial side is about 2 to 2.4% a year in constant year dollars. So not as much growth as what we've seen, but again, there's still that generational, ratcheting effect that every generation of aircraft costs more than its predecessor. All right. So what I did was I built a model out of this and said, okay, well, let's try to determine what the contribution as you move from generation to generation is from a cost perspective. So I built a model. T100 unit flyaway cost is the dependent variable, and independent variables are empty weight on the one hand, and then I have a series of dummy variables for each generation. So one for the second, third, fourth, 4.5, and 5th gen. And the results were pretty good, really. The R squared was about 93%. So that says this model explains about 93% of the variation in cost that's been observed out of this data set. All the variables are statistically significant at a 5% error level. So they're all making a significant contribution to the equation. So if we take that then and put it on a graph, and you can see how that ratcheting effect that I'm talking about here plays out. So from a 5th gen standpoint, if you were to take a 30,000 pound fighter and say, okay, if it was a first generation aircraft, it would be somewhere around at the 100th unit would be about $12 million a copy. But a second generation that was 30,000 pounds would be about 21 million, $21 million a copy. Until you got all the way to a 5th gen, and that would be 113 million a copy. So there's been obviously in the course of going from 1st generation to 5th generation about over an 800% growth, and that works out to being about 57% between generations. Now you notice from the graph that it's not necessarily evenly distributed between those generations. There's a good leap from the 1st to the 2nd, a fairly modest leap from the 2nd to the 3rd. A good leap from 3 to 4, and from 4 to 5. So some of these generations have created more cost impact, have had more cost impact than others. I think you could probably attribute that to the degree of which we were pushing the state of the art in terms of the design and the manufacturing processes. All right. It also has an interesting impact if you think about what a 6th generation aircraft might be. So again, if you assume that history follows, that the future will follow prior history, then we could expect that the 6th generation aircraft might be another 50% increase. If you just simply say, well, it's going to behave exactly as it's done in the past. Okay. So fighters are more expensive. I don't think there's any doubt about that, but they're also more capable. And is there a way for us to quantify what that capability improvement is? So in the course of the early 80s, the task developed a relative measure of U.S. tactical capability. Interestingly, the military cost handbook was developed as a companion volume of that. So the idea was they were trying to correlate performance on the one side and cost with the other. So they developed a measure that was called aircraft system performance. It's a very complicated formula. It involves a number of factors: payload, range, maneuverability, speed, target acquisition, navigational capability, survivability, and so forth. The baseline is, so these are numerical rankings, okay? Somewhat arbitrarily, they picked an F4B is equal to the number 10. And so an aircraft that has a score of 20 theoretically means that a single aircraft is equivalent to 2 F4Bs performing the same mission. So if we take that, then we can start to relate system performance against the cost and determine what that relationship might be. So if we go to this particular graph where I've taken that T100 hours per dollars per unit and graphed it against systems performance. Again, you can see that cost is increased, but later generation have significantly more capability than their predecessors. So again, if you look at what's the average ASP rating for a Gen 1 aircraft, it's 3.9. If you look at Gen 4, it's on average about a 20. So what that suggests is that a single 4th generation aircraft is equivalent to about 5 1st generation aircraft performing the same mission, because they're faster, they're more maneuverable, they're more survivable, they're able to do more. Okay. Now, the downside of this particular analysis is that I did not have ASP scores for Gen 4.5 and 5 5th generation aircraft. I couldn't locate any scores that anybody had put together. And to be fair, I suspect that the entire scale would have to be reworked today. Remember, the scale was put together in the early 80s because we had a number of advances since then. You've got advanced radar, you've got a highly sophisticated surface-to-air missiles systems that's really significantly altered the definition of survivability, for instance, which is why stealth technology was invented in the first place as an attempt to deal with that. So I think it would be safe to say, however, that Gen 4.5 and Gen 5 aircraft would be more capable, would have higher ASP scores than their predecessors. So I think we can directly correlate cost on the one hand with improved capability on the other, and give us some measure of quantification on how much are we getting for it. We're paying more, what are we getting for it in terms of the performance? All right, so here's the flip side of that whole conversation. And it poses a rather interesting chicken or egg question. So on the one hand, we can see that production rates have decreased very, very significantly from the first jet aircraft that were produced. Gen 1 aircraft, on average, the average annual production rate was 510 aircraft a year. And now what I'm measuring here are production rates in the lot that produced that 100th aircraft. So very, very high. If you go back, the F-86, it's actually over 800 a year. And that falls dramatically as we move from generation. So 510, 125 in Gen 2, all the way down to 33 a year in Gen 5. Remember, I'm measuring the 100th unit. So yes, F-35 production is higher today than 30 plus aircraft a year, but at the 100th unit, that's about the level of production that it was at. So the interesting question is, are production rates lower because flyaway prices are higher, or because later gen aircraft are more capable and therefore you don't need as many? I suspect the answer is probably some mix of both. But again, to pose it back to what Augustine's concern is, that if the price keeps increasing, at some point you have to drop the quantities that you buy, even though yes, technology buys you more capability. At some point it simply becomes too expensive to procure large quantities. All right, so let's go back and look at Augustine's law and look at what his predictions were today, and see how they panned out. So if we look at what he put together, let's start with his projection of the gross national product. So by 2019, he had projected that it would be about $22.5 trillion. The actual number was 21. For a 40-year projection, I think that's pretty good. In fact, if it hadn't been for the depth and severity of the 2008 recession, he might have hit it straight on. From a defense budget standpoint, he was actually low. So by his projections, the defense budget would be $351 billion. In reality, it's over 600, almost 700 billion. So he put that together. That was prior to the Reagan buildup. That was prior to the war on terror, and 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the defense budget, as it turns out, was significantly higher than what he originally forecast. He was furthest off on the tactical aircraft cost. So by now, if you worked out the math, a single aircraft should cost $6 billion. Well, happily, the current answer is no. The answer is more in the 140 million a unit range. Again, we're talking 100th unit. So we can see that the newest aircraft, F-18EF, F-22, F-35, have pulled off that trend line, and we're no longer increasing the cost at 15% a year in then-year dollars. Good news, yay. Bad news is this is an awfully large scale, as you can see. So even relatively small movements still show some significant increases. So we've pulled off from the trend that Augustine observed, but we've still got issues to deal with in terms of cost growth for tactical aircraft. There's still an issue, not as severe as perhaps what Augustine thought, but there's still some issues going on. A corollary of Augustine's analysis was that he looked at the duration and the build phase of aircraft development and concluded that it was virtually unchanged for 40 years. So if you went from contract award to the year of first flight and how many months it took to get to that first flight, he really didn't observe any trend at all in terms of going all the way back to the 1940s, and depending on whether it was military or commercial aircraft, really didn't make a difference. It was taking just as long to develop aircraft programs regardless of the passage of time. Again, I think that the subtle message there is that, hey, we've got production costs that are rising, and yet somehow it doesn't take me any longer to develop these aircraft. So maybe the story that it's all due to technology improvements is not really the case. So what I did was I looked at these aircraft, again, sorted things out from a generational standpoint, and looked at what is the period of time between, in my case, I went from span months from milestone B to the first production delivery. Now, and it is absolutely true that from the pre-1980 period, you really don't see much of a trend. But however, when you throw the most recent aircraft in there, F-18, EF, F-22, F-35, there definitely is an increase in development spans, okay? And if you look at it from the standpoint of what's the relationship between those development spans, the length of those development spans, and the unit flyaway cost, again, you see a correlation. It's really largely created by the most recent aircraft in terms of the longer it takes me to go develop the aircraft, the higher my production costs are, or perhaps you want to see it as vice versa. Again, it's a little bit of a chicken or egg question, but there is a relationship between those two, the most current data shows, and I think that's widely recognized now that it's taking us longer and longer and longer to go develop tactical aircraft. And that's one of the things that the department's made a big effort to try to reduce for future procurements, is to reduce the amount of time it takes us to go develop and field aircraft. All right, so let's talk about Augustine's laws. And whether or not they came true or not. So they're not really intended to be interpreted literally, but they're tongue-in-cheek empirical observations. But if we did take them literally, what would our conclusions be? So let's run through. So proposition number one would be the price of a tactical aircraft is increasing by 15% a year and eventually will exceed the entire defense budget. Taken literally, that proposition is clearly false. The most recent aircraft show a slower rate of increase than observed for previous generations of fighters. And extrapolated in the future, those costs are not going to overtake either the defense budget or the gross national product. So Augustine's law, it could be said, has run into what's called Stein's law, which is named after the economist Herbert Stein, who famously told a congressional committee, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. So clearly Stein's law has come into effect, and that increase, that 15% increase on an annual basis, has slowed rather dramatically. But the observed year-over-year increase of 4% a year, excluding inflation, means that aircraft are going to get increasingly expensive, and we're going to buy lower quantities over time, which is really Augustine's point. So in a literal sense, proposition one is false, but if you back off of it a little bit and try to get to the gist of what Augustine was driving at, one has to admit that he was probably right in terms of how things seem to be playing out. Okay, let's go to proposition number two, which is that the increase in unit cost can't be explained by improvements in technical parameters, call it maneuverability, speed, weight, and is more closely tied to the passage of time. That doesn't really seem to be supported by the analysis. The relationship that we observe between the task performance metrics and the unit cost suggests that the increase in unit cost is really correlated to the technical performance of the aircraft. So it's simply not correct to say, well, the cost just grows over time and there's not a corresponding improvement in the performance and the capability of these aircraft as we move through time. I think that's probably a false statement. All right, let's go to proposition number three, which is to say that aircraft design and development spans haven't increased over time despite advances in technology and design complexity. Well, the military aircraft that are fielded after 1990 do show an increase in design and development spans, which is a trend that's been recognized by DoD leadership, and it's now a big effort on the part of the department to try to bring those spans back down and to get the aircraft to the warfighter in a more timely fashion. So, all right. So all of this analysis that I've shown, Augustine ran, that I've run, basically is all based on an assumption that you can successfully extrapolate the future from the past. And I think Mark Twain warned us about that 150 years ago in the quote that I've reproduced down here, in which he observed that over a 176-year span, the Mississippi River had shortened itself 242 miles, which is a little bit a mile in the 30 year. And therefore, as Twain says, any calm person who is not blind or idiotic can see that in the old Eludic Silurian period, just 1 million years ago, last November, the lower Mississippi River was upward of 1,300,000 miles long and stuck out over the Gulf of Mexico like a fishing rod. And by the same token, any person can see that 742 years from now, the lower Mississippi will only be 1.75 miles long, and that the cities of Cairo, Illinois, and New Orleans will have joined their streets together and have the same mayor and a mutual board of aldermen. And Twain's final remark is that there is something fascinating about science. One gets such a wholesale return of conjecture out of a trifling investment of fact. So, all that to say that that we have to take these kinds of extrapolations with a little bit of a grain of salt. Things do change. The past is not always indicative of what the future is going to have for us, but it is worthwhile trying to do analysis and understand where we've been so we can understand where in fact we're going. And that is my last chart. So 35 minutes after the hour. So Megan, I'll give you some time back.
Yes, you sure will. And, you know, there's nothing that makes my heart sing more than a Mark Twain quote. We do have a question about inflators. So let me pull that one up. Okay. We're ready for your question when you are, sir. All right, maybe we're having a mic fail. You muted yourself, it looks like.
Okay, great. Hi, great presentation. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So JPO for the F-35 uses NAVAIR's methodology for inflation indices. I think that's Global Insights. What sort of inflation indices would you recommend that we use for future fighters? It seems like that's kind of a controversial point. Different agencies use different inflation indices. So I'm just wondering, I forget which one you used in your presentation, but there's some that are currently in use.
Yeah, I used the OSD escalation for this particular analysis. I don't know that it would have really made all that much difference looking backwards. But yeah, no, I understand your point on the future. I've heard some of those. I've been involved in some of those conversations on F-35 on inflation indices. Boy, that's a tough one to answer because I don't think there's obviously not a clear-cut answer. I think my experience that I've seen is from a projection standpoint. So that's looking forward as opposed to looking backwards. I think there's a general consensus that OSD indices tend to understate future projections. And I think that's why JPO in particular has spent time looking at Global Insight or commercial indices as a way to try to get their arms around that. Obviously there's pluses and minuses both ways. I haven't noticed nearly as much when you're looking backwards, which is really kind of what we're doing here with the data. So that's why I didn't really lose too much sleep over what kind of escalation to go use. But yeah, looking forward, that's kind of a thorny issue. I guess I would fall on the side of looking at more commercial indices. Although, inflation is probably not quite as big an issue as it might have been, 20 years ago. I mean, the general rate of inflation seems to have slowed pretty substantially and maybe be slowing even further the next few years.
Okay, thank you. And one quick follow-up. In your sports broadcasting, did OU win? I mean, you know that's the truth,
That's it's funny you say that because I'm from Texas, but I was born in Waco, and I grew up as a big Baylor fan, and there was no team that we hated more than the University of Texas because they always beat us every year. So in our house, when I was a kid, we always cheered for OU to win because we wanted to see Texas get beat. So that's probably got to take away my Texan card for saying that, but.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry to out you.
Sorry, I had muted myself. So that's all the questions that we got so far. Rick Hunt, the ICEAA president, wants to say a few things. And if anybody has any other questions while Rick's chatting, send them on over.
Hey, thank you, Megan. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Excellent. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and even good evening to everyone who joined the conversation today. I got a couple messages that I'd like to convey, one to Brent and then one to the audience at large. However, before I get to those, I've actually got a question for you, Brent. I'd be interested in your opinion regarding development span and why we've seen the kind of growth that we have seen both for you know, generation 4B and generation 5?
Well, that's a good question. And I can't say that I've studied the matter to give you a really intelligent answer. But on the one hand, you would think that with more advanced design tools like we have today, with CCEA and those kinds of tools, as opposed to working off Mylars and paper drawings like we did for so many years, you'd think that we would actually design process would be faster and not slowing down. So that's kind of the paradox of it. My suspicion is that there's more testing than there used to be, and I can't really confirm that. And that might be an interesting paper for next time, is to try to dig into that deeper. But to me, I think there's a lot more emphasis a lot more effort by the testing community to try to make sure that things are just so before the aircraft gets fielded. And I think it's driven a lot more testing than I think there used to be, particularly if you go back to some of the earlier generations, like I think if you went back to the 1950s, I think there was a lot more emphasis on, well, let's just get the thing out there and the pilots will test it, right? I mean, they'll test it out in the field, which is kind of a dangerous thing to do. I mean, if you look at the casualty numbers on those Century series aircraft, they're pretty appalling how many pilots were killed. So I think people have said, oh, no, we don't want to do that. We want to have, especially as the price of the aircraft keeps going up, we want to make sure that we're getting everything that we want out of the airplane. We want to make sure that it's safe. And I think the results are, obviously we have much safer aircraft today, but on the other hand, it seems like it's taking a whole lot longer to go do that. And at some point, the testing becomes, you pass the marginal utility of the testing, I think diminishes. So that's just my impression. Other people may disagree with me, and that's certainly something that I think would be an interesting paper for the future, is if somebody goes and looks at, hey, what are some of the drivers behind some of these lengthening development spans?
Yeah, well, thanks, Brent. I mean, it's probably safe to say, and certainly not a brilliant statement, that the DoD has been a significant contributor to that span increase, I would think. I mean, certainly when you talk about testing requirements, I mean, they have a heavy hand in how that's defined, right? So
yeah, there's definitely a lot of input from the government and the government test community. And I think there's sometimes, everybody views their particular area as the most important thing. And I think obviously the test guys believe, wholeheartedly that they are doing the right thing by pushing for more testing. But at some point, like I said, the marginal utility of that next test, are you really getting anything out of it when you go do that? And you're certainly contributing quite a bit to the span of the cost. So there's some sort of happy medium between, the World War II extreme of, hey, we'll just try it in battle and see if it works, versus, testing for a decade and, and it takes that long to get it out to the field. So
yeah. Well, hey, perhaps there's someone in the audience today whose interest is piqued, and they'll go off and do a little bit of research here, and we get to hear from them, next year. So anyway, I'll get back to the couple of messages that I wanted to convey, one to Brent and then to the audience at large, and then get off the stage here. So first, congratulations, Brent. I mean, winning, you're not new to writing papers, but winning a Best Paper Award's a big deal. I mean, it's recognition for a job well done, and reward for going the extra mile to write a paper. So, you know, and any one of us can put together some sound bites on briefing charts and give a presentation, but you know, writing the paper, going through the iterations of it, I think is you know, is a real accomplishment. So you know, definitely appreciate you writing the paper and presenting today. And I think, you know, your presentation today is a great example of kind of one of the aspects of cost analysis that got me hooked 40 years ago. I mean, being able to get yourself a decent data set and analyze it and hypothesize and draw conclusions based on the analysis. And you know, it was great to see the use of dummy variables. So there are a lot of aspects of what you did that I think are really great. So congrats and thanks again to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now the second message, which I view as equally and perhaps even more important for the rest of the audience, is that you know, if you're fortunate enough to have an abstract accepted in the future, I really encourage you to go the extra mile and write a paper. And you know, there's at least three reasons for that recommendation. One is it qualifies you for one of the coveted best paper awards, and you know, the accompanying recognition that comes with that, be it recognition from ICEAA, recognition from your employer, recognition from your colleagues inside and outside your organization. The second reason I encourage it is that, you know, the process of authoring a paper will be an invaluable learning experience. I mean, the type of learning experience that could set you apart from your colleagues. You know, I will not hesitate to say that I believe that effective technical writing is becoming a lost art, and certainly an ICEAA paper is an opportunity to practice and build those skills. And you know, frankly, there's no substitute for being able to communicate your thoughts in writing, and in fact in more than just, you know, soundbite bullets. And then third and final, you know, reason I think writing a paper is a good thing is because the paper is going to be readily available to not only ICEAA members, but the general public by virtue of the ICEAA workshop archives that, you know, you can find if you go to the ICEAA's website, and that includes 12 years of workshop papers and presentations. And you know, if someone goes out there and Googles your name, there's a good chance they're going to get a hit that's going to include, you know, work that you've done for ICEAA in terms of a workshop, be it writing a paper or a presentation. So anyway, yeah. I highly encourage those of you in the audience who have written papers in the past or who haven't to, you know, think seriously about doing it in the future. So, Megan, I think that's all I've got to say, and that's probably a good segue to something that you want to advertise, right?
It absolutely does, and I'm actually going to put up a little visual for everybody, so to
cool.
Make it all nice and pretty. There we go. So I hope everybody's been enjoying these best paper presentations that we've been doing throughout end of May and into June. And starting on July 1, we're going to continue showing some more of the presentations that were accepted for San Antonio, but unfortunately will not be able to be shown in San Antonio. So go on to the ICEAA webpage, or you can go to ICEAonline.com/calendar to take a look at what we've got scheduled. We have every Wednesday at noon scheduled until August 26th, and then we're likely to announce another batch of scheduling for the fall. So I look forward to hearing from you throughout the summer. And I believe with no more questions and anything else for Rick or Brent to add.
Megan, I got one other thing to add.
Sure.
The order of these presentations, or the first batch of additional presentations, are presentations that go with papers that were submitted for the conference. So, in keeping with what I said about, it's a lot of work to write a paper. We wanted to give those folks who had actually submitted papers for consideration for the workshop first shot at presenting. So that's this next batch of presentations that you're going to hear. People who actually did the hard work to write a paper.
Hard work being rewarded in that sense.
Yes.
Well, Brent, do you have any closing remarks?
Nope, I just appreciate the opportunity to speak to y'all. And like I said, I wish we were all there together, but better luck next year. So.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for tuning in. Stay safe, stay sane, stay healthy, be excellent to each other, and have an awesome afternoon.